Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one there are numerous advances in favor of the Russians within the Donetsk region, with a number of Ukrainian counterattacks which took place in the western outskirts of the Zaporizhia region over the past 2 weeks. The Russians are consolidating and expanding their positions on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, as the Ukrainians have yet to stop these advances. The Russians also managed to advance to the northwest of Chasiv Yar and entering into Sarishne across the Zherebets river line here in the northern parts of the Donetsk region. Starting out in the northern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians have managed to expand the zone of control and consolidate position in several sections of the front line. Directly to the north of Pokrovsk, northwest of Rodinsk, the Russians have managed to gain control over additional fortified positions along the main highway and are consolidating their positions by capturing the railway line in between Rodinsk and the industrial area here to the northwest. Gaining control over the industrial area in the northwest and in the west of Rodinsk will allow the Russians to consolidate their positions along the main highway and on the flank of Rodinsk, completely isolating the city from the reinforcements of the Azov forces looking to stabilize the situation. The Russians isolating Rodinsk will allow them to continue offensive operations towards the city to gain full control of it here on the northern flank of Pokrovsk and have their own logistical hub for further offensive operations in the direction of Reshene in the west and along the highway to the north, as well as the railway. Further north along the railway, the Russians have managed to advance to the north of Novoshakhove, where they are storming both Vilna, Shakhove and Ivanivka, as well as Troshne. Here on the western flank, they're looking to gain full control of the railway area, as well as roads leading up to the settlements here on the western flank of the offensive operations. They're fighting over all of these settlements to gain control of them for the western flank of the offensive operations and the spearhead further north, which the Russians have now managed to consolidate the positions within Chasiv Yar, and according to a Ukrainian source that is based in Dobropilya, the Ukrainian locals within the town of Consolidating claims that the Russians have full control over the town. Based on that, I have colored it over. The Russians seems to be consolidating their positions on the outskirts. However, the Ukrainians have managed to kick out the Russians from Vesele, which shows that the tip of the spearhead is where the fighting is taking place, where the Russians have been unable to consolidate the positions within Vesele, but reportedly have control over Consolidating. As the Russians continue offensive operations further northwest in the direction of Petrivka, Novodiane, Rubishne, they are also looking to consolidate the position to the southwest to have a stable supply line to the frontline positions. And we are also seeing advances by the Russians on the eastern flank, looking to gain control over the first lines leading up to Hrushke and Vesele, as well as fighting over the fortified positions along the road to cut off the connection between the Ukrainian positions in the northern outskirts with the ones here to the eastern flank, where the Russians continue offensive operations over the fortified positions west of Volodymyrivka. Following their foothold within the town, Russians are now also expanding their zone of control to the west of the settlements to begin the battle over Shakhove and Volodymyrivka. To the northwest of Poltavka, the Russians have managed to gain control over additional forest lines and fields as they fight over the fortified positions along the river line. The Russians are here clearly moving towards along the river line towards the northwest, where they're looking to cut off the roads between Novopavlivka and Sofievka while attacking the pocket itself directly from the south, storming the settlements such as Volodymyrivka and Shakhove, while also attacking the flank here in the western direction towards Toretsk and Sofievka. This shows an intention by the Russians to isolate these four settlements from their supply lines by attacking their flanks and their supply lines. This will allow the Russians to attack these four settlements and the Ukrainian forces within them without letting them withdraw, without being under direct fire control by the Russian forces, or limiting the reinforcements going into these settlements to further secure the eastern flank and have additional crossings across the river line. The Russian objective to gain control over these positions here in the north isn't just to expand the zone of control, but it is also to defend the northern flank for any potential Ukrainian counterattacks. the Ukrainians would be able to establish positions here in the east with their reinforcements coming in to counterattack the Russian offensive operations. This could be aiming towards cutting off the supply lines leading up to these forward positions, which would limit the supplies or completely cut off the Russian forces on the front line, which would end the offensive operations by the Russians here on the northern flank of Pokrovsk. Therefore, the Russians are working on consolidating their positions by attacking these 4 settlements on the eastern bank, which will allow the Russians to have additional supply lines leading up to the frontline positions and a buffer zone between their forces and the Ukrainian forces. Further to the east, the Russians managed to advance northwest of Chasiv Yar. They've already captured the fortified positions south of Maisky. Now they're advancing further to the west, bypassing the town as they're looking to advance in the direction of Verolyubivka. The Russians advancing along the main road here and are advancing in the northern direction towards the western flank of Maisky to gain control of the fortified positions there, which will allow them to flank the town of Maisky and the fortified positions near Markove, securing the northern flank of Chasiv Yar and expanding the zone of control on the northern flank of Kostiantynivka for the operational encirclement of the city. Frontline situation near Kostiantynivka is a general advance by the Russians on a wide front around the city, the southern, western and northern directions, as well as the capture of Redichyne in the eastern flank. This all adds up to the Russians slowly operationally encircling the city, but the next line of defense, which is the last one for the Ukrainians ahead of an operational encirclement, seems to be well fortified and garrisoned, which leaves no gaps in their defenses, which is why the Russians seem to be struggling with the operational encirclement of the city. Instead, what we're seeing is that the Russians are doubling down on the offensive operations north of Pokrovsk, which are seeing more success as the Ukrainians are still in the middle of their rotation to send reinforcements and establish a defensive line before counterattacking in the northern flank. The Russians are here working to see how much they can consolidate and gain before the Ukrainians stabilize the situation, which could determine how long the battle over Pokrovsk, Dobropilya, Rudinsky and Biletsky will end up taking here on the northern flank of Pokrovsk. Further north in the direction of Sarishne, the Russians have crossed over the Sherebets River line in another point and established themselves within the northern parts of Sarishne. We see based on this that the Russians now have 2 footholds within the town across the Sherebets River line between Torske and Sarishne. While fighting also continues on the northern flank west of Kolodyasy, the Russians bypassed the town and are fighting over the fortified positions here to the west of Kolodyasy to gain control over the remaining parts of the town, with fighting also entering into the direction of Myrne here on the northern flank of Sarishne. Russians are here working getting control over the final fortified positions ahead of the second line of defense outside of Liman. The Russians are working on gaining control over Sarishne on the eastern flank, which is a part of this second line of defense, while attacking in the direction of Shenjalova and Sarishne, which all add up to offensive operations on the second line of defense ahead of Liman, as well as the supply lines leading into and out of Liman. The Russians are looking to gain control over Sarishne on the eastern flank to have a direct road towards Liman and to secure the northern flank of the Serbiansky forest area where fighting is taking place within. Russians also looking to gain control over the fortified positions north of Stavki to establish control over the roads leading into Liman from the north and the supply lines on the western flank to cut off and limit the supplies for the Ukrainian forces. Moving on to the southern section of the front line, where the Ukrainians have managed to counterattack in the direction of Kamyansk. Over the past 2 weeks, the Ukrainians have launched numerous counterattacks where they have been attempting to regain control over the Dacha area here in the direction of Plevny, as well as securing the western flank of the apartment complex area south of Stevnohirsk, and launched several counterattacks on the eastern flank as well, regaining control over a fortified position and looking to re-enter Kamyansk and cut off the Russian forward positions by attacking their flanks. The Ukrainians have managed to gain control over parts of the highway and are establishing a foothold within the southern parts of the Dacha area. They're looking to cut off the forward positions of the Russians by attacking the Russian rear positions, cutting it off from Kamyansk. The Ukrainians would need to cut off the riverline positions here west of Kamyansk, where the Russians have no fortified positions, only entrenched forces defending against the Ukrainian counterattacks, to which the Ukrainians would be able to isolate their forward positions from the settlement itself. On the eastern flank, they're looking to push towards the central parts of Kamyansk from a less fortified area into the trenches, which are facing southwards. Therefore, they are not adjusted to deal with Ukrainian counterattacks. And the forward positions of the Russians are also being counterattacked west of the apartment complex area, following Ukrainian airstrikes and artillery strikes on those positions. Russians are facing a lot of resistance here in the Zaporizhia section of the front line, as it is well defended, well garrisoned, and well supplied. The Ukrainian defenses here in the Zaporizhia section of the front line at this point surpasses the Ukrainian defenses within the Donetsk region, as the main defensive lines of the Donetsk region have already been captured by the Russians, while the defenses in the Zaporizhia region are being fortified day after day with the little movement that has happened over that section of the front line for the past 3 years. The current situation that is seen across the front line is that the Russians are consistently advancing within the Donetsk region as their main efforts, especially this month of August, where they have barely advanced in any other section of the front line. 90% of the Russian advances the first 2 weeks of August have been in the Donetsk region, numbering approximately 200 square kilometers of net gains. How did this situation come about? It is due to the heavy losses the Ukrainians have suffered over the past few years, especially with their Kursk incursion. Speaking of the Kursk incursion, a Wall Street Journal article talks with one of the former commanders of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, who submitted a resignation report calling the generals of the armed forces of Ukraine clueless and the command's orders stupid. Later, he stated that during battles in the Kursk region, the command gave tasks that were doomed to fail and exposed personnel to a high likelihood of unjustified losses. People die without understanding why. The commanders didn't care about the personnel, another armed forces member. Siversk in turn called Sirchin a person craving attention, but according to the Wall Street Journal, he remains extremely unpopular among Ukrainian soldiers. Many point to his delays in issuing withdrawal orders and demoralizing orders to advance. It is almost as if withdrawing is in and of itself a defeat, while in some cases it is much better than staying and fighting. An example is the breakthrough of the Russian forces north of Pokrovsk. I would say the main cause of this is likely the Ukrainians never withdrawing. If the Ukrainians withdraw from some positions that are in danger, they would not take as many losses, but on top of that, they would also be able to re-establish defensive lines in the rear. Instead, what we see is that now the Russians defeat a grouping of Ukrainian armed forces. If no reinforcements arrive, or if there's no second line of defense, the Russians can just freely walk through these positions and capture them without any resistance, as there simply are no more Ukrainian soldiers standing in their way. This creates more difficult situations that require more soldiers to contain, which has resulted in the redirection of the Azov forces from other sectors of the front line to the Pokrovsk section to contain a situation that never should have happened on the Ukrainian side in the first place. Instead, the Russians are now seeing a lot of success. Whether the Ukrainians will be able to contain it with their reinforcements is yet to be seen. If they succeed, they will have plugged the gap of a disaster, but it will still have consequences for the entire section of the front line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.